In this video, I'd like to give an overview of the different types of layers that you can create or that you might encounter when working on your photos. I'll be demonstrating how to use some of these layer types in later videos. However, some of the layer types you see here are a bit beyond the scope of this course. So I won't be going into depth with some of them, and the type tool is a good example of this. But I still want you to be familiar with all of these layer types so you know how to approach them if you see them in other tutorials outside of this course. Let's begin discussing the different types of layers that you can use in Photoshop. And we'll begin with the background layer. The background layer is always at the bottom of the layers panel. And when you open up a photo, if it has a background layer, it's simply going to be called background. It begins locked, just like you see here, but you can still manipulate it by painting on it and doing a few other things. It does have a few limitations, but for the most part, you will not be touching this layer. That's kind of the whole point of working with layers. You'll see there it has a lock icon, so it's pretty easy to unlock it if you do need to manipulate it. You can also create a background layer as well. Let's go ahead and jump over into Photoshop and take a look at this background layer. As you can see here, I have this image open, and on the layers panel, I have that background layer active. That's the only layer that's inside of this document. Most of the time, you are going to leave this layer alone. You probably won't want to do anything with it if you want to work non-destructively. But if you ever do need to, let's say, move this layer, transform it, or something along those lines, then you'll want to unlock it. Unlocking it is extremely simple. You just go over to that lock icon and click it, and now you have a basic layer. You can do anything to this layer now that you can to any other layer that you would add or create here inside of Photoshop. Another thing you can do is actually create a background layer. You probably won't have a lot of use for this for basic photo editing, but if you ever get into anything more advanced, like creating your own actions, for example, then you may actually want to convert an existing layer into a background layer. So the way you do that is you click whichever layer that you want to be your background layer. You go up to Layer, New, and then select Background from Layer. Now here I only had one layer in that document, so it just kind of converted things back to normal, but it would take any layer and move it to the bottom and change that to the background layer if you wanted to. So that's a little bit of a pro tip about working with background layers inside of Photoshop. Like I said, for the most part, you're going to leave that background layer untouched, and you'll be adding layers on top of that background layer to keep your edits non-destructive in order to get that look that you want. The next type of layer we'll discuss is a pixel layer. Pixel layers are basic image layers. They're also anything that you maybe have brushed on, like creating a dodge and burn layer, for example. That's another type of pixel layer. They're also very destructible, meaning it's really easy to kind of do things to that layer that you cannot recover. What you see here on the left is an extremely zoomed in version of that background layer. The background layer itself is also a pixel layer. You can actually see those pixels in that kind of grid view, and all of those pixels combined, when you zoom out, it actually looks like the photo. So now let's go ahead and jump over and dig a little bit deeper into pixel layers in Photoshop. I'm now inside of Photoshop and I have that same image open. I'm going to zoom way in and just keep going in and in and in. And now you can actually see those pixels. And I'll just zoom around so you can kind of get a feel. And this is actually what the pixels look like up close here in Photoshop. And then as I zoom out, the image becomes clearer and clearer until I get all the way out. Now let's talk a little bit about kind of how fragile these pixel layers can be. In the Layers panel, I'm going to unlock this background layer so that I can transform it. Then I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut Command or Control T, and this will allow me to actually transform the layer. I'm going to resize it, and I'm just going to make it really, really small. And I'll press Return to commit that change. So now if I zoom in and kind of scroll over, there's my tiny little image there in the corner. Next, I'm going to transform this again, but I'm going to expand it back to its original size. So I'll use that keyboard shortcut again, Command or Control T, And then I'm just going to take that corner and drag it all the way out. Make sure I get it nice and centered there. And then I'll press return. Looks like I'm a little off center there, but that's fine. You can see a little bit of that transparent background there, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. But what I am going to worry about is how awful this photo looks now that I've scaled it all the way down and then scaled it all the way back up. If I zoom in again, all of those pixels are still there. It's just that I lost a lot of detail. So there's a lot of kind of fuzzy areas. If I were to save this image and then open it back up again, there's no way I could recover that. But because I'm still working on this image here in Photoshop and I haven't done anything, I can just backtrack with a couple of undo steps to get back to that original image. But it's really easy to kind of destroy those pixels in your image. Another thing that would also make it a very destructive type of layer is if I was just to brush all over this. So I'm going to switch over to my brush tool, and I have kind of a purple color there in my swatch. If I were to just start brushing over this image, and it obviously looks horrible, then if I were to zoom in, all of those pixels are now that kind of purple color until I scroll up, and then it just fades into the original color. So I've literally changed what those pixels look like. And I'm again, if I were to save this and come back to it, I would not be able to recover that original image. So I'm actually going to just kind of undo. And let's get back to our nice, beautiful, and in focus photo that we had. So that's a little bit more about pixel layers. Pixel layers are going to be images that you bring in, like a copy and paste thing, anything that you would brush over on your photo in a pixel type layer, those are going to be pixels. So just be kind of careful when working with them and make sure you don't manipulate the pixels or the layer size by transforming it too much if you want to really retain the best quality in your images. Another type of layer that you may encounter are shape and vector layers. You can create shapes inside of Photoshop using the shape tool. Most often you'll be creating either rectangles or ellipses, squares, rectangles, circles, ovals, and things like that. Illustrations created inside of Adobe Illustrator is another example of a vector. And one of the benefits of working with shapes and vectors is that they are editable and re-editable without affecting the overall quality. When I was discussing pixel layers, I showed you how fragile they can be if you were to resize them. But I'm going to show you how easy it is to resize a shape or a vector without actually damaging the layer itself. Let's jump over to Photoshop and I will show you an example of this. So this document has just a simple white background layer. There's nothing fancy about it. Let's go ahead and add a shape to this. Over in the Layers panel, I'm going to access that rectangular tool, but instead of using a rectangle, I'm going to add a custom shape. So I'm going to right-click that tool and then select Custom Shape Tool. Up in the top options bar, you can actually choose a shape. There's going to be a lot of default shapes here, but I'm just going to go ahead and choose one of these flowers because it has a lot of nice detail and it will make for a really good demonstration of what I'd like to show you. So I'm just going to click that flower to activate it. I also want to set the fill to a color, so I'm just going to pick any random color here. And the stroke, you can change the colors if you want, but like I said previously, these things are re-editable and very easy to change. So I'm just going to start out with those two colors. I'm going to click and drag, and you want to make sure that you're holding that shift key if you want to keep it proportional. So I've added my shape. If I press return, now I can see it in all its glory. Now it looks kind of funny because it's got a weird stroke or, kind of a border around the entire shape, and then it's got filled in with all these kind of funny colors. But shapes like this are very easy to re-edit. Now let's go ahead and look over in the Layers panel real quickly at this tool. You'll notice that there's a little icon on the bottom right, and it just called this, Shape 52-1. I believe that's referencing the actual shape that I pulled from that dropdown. It also has a checkerboard background there, and that's indicating that it has transparency. That means that the only thing on this layer is that shape. If I look over in the Tools panel, I still have that tool active, and I can see that I have the fill and stroke colors set to what I chose originally. There's also a border around it. But because I have that tool active and I have that layer active, I can actually resize things, and you'll actually see it kind of change as I'm making those adjustments. So then maybe I could change that stroke color and just go with a simple black stroke, and then I could change the fill color to, let's try a pink. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to duplicate this layer and show you the difference between working with a shape layer and a pixel layer. So over in the Layers panel, I'm just going to click and drag this layer to that new layer icon, and that just copies the layer. I'm going to access my Move tool. Holding my Shift key, I'm just going to move it to the right, and then that just keeps it nice and level with the other image. I'm also going to change the color of the new flower so it's a little easier to tell the difference between the two. So I'll press U, and that brings me to that Shape tool. And then I'll take that fill color, and I'll just go ahead and change this one to green. And I'll press return, and that will get rid of that outline. Now over in the Layers panel, I'm going to select both of these layers, and I'm going to transform them. So I'll use that keyboard shortcut Command or Control T. I'm going to hold my Option key, and that will just keep everything centered, and then I'm just going to make them really small. So I have two shape layers here, and I have a duplicate one on the right. I'm going to take that one on the right-click over it, and I'm going to say that I want to rasterize this layer. And what that does is it basically removes all of the vector properties from the image, and it just turns it into a regular pixel image. So it still looks the same, but the top layer up there is rasterized. In fact, let me go ahead and rename this. So this is a pixel layer, and this one is a shape or a vector layer. I'm going to go ahead and select both of these layers once again. I'm going to use that keyboard shortcut Command or Control T, hold my Option key, and that just keeps it centered while I resize, and then bring it back. So as you can see, that image on the left, the stroke border stayed the same throughout the whole resize process, and it kind of went back to the way it was before. Whereas the image on the right, once I shrunk it down and then converted it into a pixel layer, everything was kind of frozen in that state. So then I was really just enlarging something and just kind of trying to stretch it out to be basically what it was at a smaller size, but just make it bigger. With most of your photo editing, it's unlikely that you will use and work with a lot of these types of layers, but creating things like a collage might be an example of when you might want to use a shape layer. And don't worry, I'm going to show you how to create a collage in one of the projects towards the end. But this is a good example and a good representation of the big difference between working with a vector layer and a pixel layer. Adjustment layers are used to edit your photos. They are probably the type of layer that you will use most along with image layers. The beauty about adjustment layers is that they are non-destructive. Instead of applying all of those edits to the background layer and kind of burning them all in, you can add multiple adjustment layers to increase and kind of enhance an overall effect. Let's go ahead and jump into Photoshop. We'll take a look at this photo and we'll preview some of those adjustment layers. But don't worry, because in a later video, I'm going to walk through the most common types of adjustment layers that you are probably going to want to use in Photoshop when editing your images. Here's that same image with these adjustment layers added to it. I'll go ahead and go to that background layer, and I'm going to press and hold the Option or Alt key while clicking on that eyeball, and that kind of just hides the other layers. So for this image, I added first a curves adjustment, and that mostly just added some brightness to it. If you go ahead and look over in those curves properties, you can kind of move that curve around, and I really just wanted to kind of enhance the tone by adding a touch of brightness. I also used a hue saturation adjustment. And if you look over in the properties panel, you're not really seeing much of an adjustment made. But what I did was I clicked on this drop down, I went to the magentas, and then I played with kind of the coloring in that flower. So if I were to bring it back closer to 0, you can see it has a lot more blue in it. It's a little bit more pinkish, and I just wanted to make it a little bit warmer. So I increased it. I didn't want to go too far because things were going to start kind of blooming and looking funny. I just wanted to kind of give it a little bit more warmth to the petals. I also added a vibrance, and this is a very subtle adjustment that I added. Vibrance has both vibrance and saturation. You can play with the sliders and the settings. But as you're seeing here, one of the benefits is I'm actually able to go back and re-edit these layers as much as I want to. So you actually access all of your adjustment layers from the Adjustments panel. If you don't see it, you'll want to go up to Window, Adjustments, make sure there's a check next to it, and that means it's visible inside of your workspace. You simply just click on one of these adjustments to add it to the image, and then all of those adjustment settings will show up inside of that Properties panel. You can also delete those adjustment layers. You just kind of want to click in that blank space on the adjustment layer and either press that delete key, or you can go to the bottom of the layers panel and click that little trash icon. It will just ask for you to confirm it. I don't really want to see this again, so I'll click that box and click yes. Just so you know, if you are trying to delete an adjustment, sometimes when you click delete, if you go ahead and watch that vibrance layer, if you click delete, sometimes it deletes the mask, and then you have to click delete again to actually get rid of the entire adjustment. So you might come across that if you're kind of working and kind of removing things that you've done. But it's really easy to work with these adjustments. If you wanted to add a black and white layer, just click black and white. I'm going to delete that because I don't want to turn this into black and white because it has so much beautiful color in it. You can also add adjustment layers by going up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. Obviously, that takes a little bit more time to do that, but you are able to see all the names of those adjustments. And as opposed to actually editing the image layer itself, which you'd go to Image Adjustments, but you can see that you can't add everything here. And in fact, you kind of want to avoid this altogether because that's where you're going to have those destructive edits that you want to avoid. But I do want to show you where they're located in Photoshop in case you do find a good need for them. But for the most part, I highly encourage you to work with adjustment layers because you have a lot more flexibility. You can re-edit, you can manipulate, you can blend, you can change the opacity. There's just a lot more control that you have in Photoshop when working with adjustment layers. Fill layers are another type of layer you can add, and those are color fill, pattern fill, and gradient fill layers. These are used a lot to stylize and also for design work, so you may find some use for certain types of layers. I tend to use the solid color fill layers more than the other ones, but I encourage you to kind of play around with the other layer types just to kind of see what they do. They're also re-editable and non-destructive, just like any other layer, similar to how adjustment layers work. So as you can see in this image here, what I've done is I added a color layer and I just kind of blended it with a blend mode to give that image a different effect, kind of like a black and white sepia effect. Let's jump into Photoshop and I'll set this up and show you how I added this color fill layer to my image. So here's my image. It's a background layer. There's only one layer in that layers panel. And let's go ahead and add that color fill layer. So the easiest way to get to these types of layers is to go to the layers panel and click that little adjustment icon and then select which one you want to play with. For this example, I will go ahead and choose solid color. As soon as that happens, I get to pick the color I want to work with. So I'm just going to go ahead and try to find kind of like a brownish sepia color, and I'll go ahead and click OK. Now, in order to actually see this do anything on my photo, I need to change that blend mode. So I'm going to go up to that drop down. It starts out with normal, and then I'm just going to go all the way down and change that to color. So now I've just desaturated and added a little bit of a sepia look to the scene. Now, if I wanted to, I can easily change this. It's very editable, so you don't really have to worry about that first color that you choose when you're kind of picking that color for the first time. To re-edit it, just double-click that thumbnail icon, and now I can maybe move it and maybe find something that's in a little bit more of the yellowish zone, and then click OK. So they're really simple and easy to work with. Like I said, you're probably more likely going to use that color option more than the others, but it's always fun to play around in Photoshop. If you were to choose the pattern one, what you'll see is it just fills the entire space with a pattern. You have a few other settings here, but you can click that drop down and kind of see what some of your default patterns are. You know, there's just a lot of different ones. Your options might look a little different here than what I have, but it's good to know that that option exists because you might find a use for it down the road. In Photoshop, you can do one thing in many different ways, and me showing you how to use that solid color fill layer is just another way to add kind of a tinted color look to your image. Let's talk a little bit about the Type tool. So Type is a way for you to add text to your photos. It's actually another type of vector, meaning if you type something at a really small size, you can enlarge it and resize it as long as it's still an active type layer and you haven't converted it into a pixel like I showed you with that vector layer. Type layers are re-editable and non-destructive, so they're really great when you need to add a little bit of text to your image. And adding a watermark might be the most common use for most photographers, but of course, there are a lot of different ways that you can work with type in a photo, so go ahead and get creative and see what you can come up with. Let's jump into Photoshop and I'll show you how to add a watermark like this to your image. I have my image open here in Photoshop, and if you look over in the Layers panel, it's just a simple background layer. I don't have anything else added to it. Let's go ahead and add some type. You can either access it by clicking it over in that Layers panel, and of course you'll want to work with that horizontal type tool. You'll see that cursor change. You can also use the keyboard shortcut T, and that will get you to that type tool as well. Then just click inside your image and it will come up with some default text. It's lorem ipsum is what it is, and it's really tiny there. You can barely see it. And that's because at the very top, I have that type set to a really, really small font size. So I'm just going to click this and just kind of choose something a little bit larger. I'll make it even a little bit bigger there for these purposes. You can choose your font here at the top. So I'll just pick kind of a simple one there, and you can choose your font weight. And then there's a few other options here as well, but I'm not going to get into too much detail with the type tool. I'm just going to show you how to make a nice quick watermark. So the type here is active, and you can see it's highlighted, and that's just the default text that it adds anytime you click in your image with that type tool. If I were to hit the escape key, then it's kind of going to commit that. And if you look over in the Layers panel, you can see that it says lorem ipsum, and it's just simple type layer. I'm going to resize this real quickly by using that keyboard shortcut Command or Control T, and I'll just make it really big, press return. If I access that type tool, if you look up at the top there, you can see that the font size has actually changed. So it knows how big or how small you've changed it, and it's just going to kind of resize accordingly. Let's go ahead and edit this text so it actually is a little bit more appropriate for my image here. So I have that type tool active. I'm just going to click inside the text. I can select all of the text with a keyboard shortcut, so Command or Control A, and then I'm going to type my copyright. So I'm going to create that copyright symbol. And by the way, if you want to create a copyright symbol on a Mac, you'll use the keyboard shortcut Option G. And if you are on Windows platform, you're going to use Alt 0169. Basically, you want to press and hold the Alt key and then type 0169, and it will create that copyright symbol for you. And then I'll just go ahead and type my name. And I'll press Escape when I'm finished. And then I want to resize and relocate this to the bottom corner of my image. So I'll use that keyboard shortcut Command or Control T. And I'll just take a corner and just resize it. You don't need to hold the Shift key or anything. That will actually kind of warp or deform the shape of it. And I'll just drop it there in the corner, and then I'll press Return or Enter to commit that. Now, because this is on its own layer, another thing you might want to do is maybe drop the opacity of your type layer so it blends in a little bit and the watermark is not too distracting. So you can take that opacity slider in the Layers panel and just kind of fade it away. And so that's just a really quick overview of that type tool inside of Photoshop. The great thing about it is that it's very re-editable, so you can make any changes, fix a mistake or a typo. You can resize it, you can change the font, you can do a lot of different things with it. Let's talk a little bit about smart object layers. Smart objects are kind of a special kind of layer. They are very non-destructive, editable layers. They work well with raw photos and filters and plugins. They're kind of the ultimate non-destructive file. And I'm going to show you this example and how you might want to use it with a photograph. So let's go ahead and jump over into Photoshop, and I will kind of set this up and explain how smart objects work with photography. Here I have that photo open that you saw on that slide, and if you look over in the Layers panel, there's only one layer. There's no background layer, but if you look in the corner in the bottom right of that thumbnail, it has a little icon there indicating that it's a smart object. Now, what I did to set this up was I was inside of Lightroom and I made some adjustments in Lightroom. And then I chose to edit it into Photoshop, but I chose the option that allows you to edit it as a smart object. So basically what I have here is I have a layer that is still basically a raw file. So what I'm going to do to start out and show you how this works is I'm going to double click this thumbnail icon, and this opens it up into Camera Raw. Now, Camera Raw and Lightroom, they basically run on the same engine. So the things I can do inside of Lightroom, I can do inside of Camera Raw. And Camera Raw is going to read all of those Lightroom edits that I did and display them here inside of Camera Raw. This is more than just a simple layer. I actually have the raw file. If you look at the top, you can see the file name and that it's a DNG file. And that's just the raw file type that I chose to save this image as. So I have full editability of things like the white balance. So if I needed to make an adjustment, I could fix that white balance. You have more flexibility with your exposure and your tone settings. You can also change your profile if you wanted to. And let me go ahead and browse those. And maybe I'll change it to something that's a little bit more bright and vivid or a little bit more subdued. And maybe continue playing with some of those other settings. So I was able to fully save that raw data inside of that smart object layer, and I can click OK. That will save and update the file, and I could go back and forth and do that as many times as I want. I can even have adjustment layers or any other type of layer added above the smart object, and it would just continually refresh every time I went back to make edits. Another thing that smart objects are really good for is when you want to edit the layer with a plugin or a filter, but maybe be able to go back and re-edit those settings. So I'm going to go ahead and show this with a filter here in Photoshop. So I have that layer active. I'll go over to Filter. I'll go down to Stylize, and let's go ahead and add an oil paint effect. I'm just going to kind of play around, and I'm not going to be too picky with these settings here. And I'll just go ahead and click OK so we can kind of get this going and you can see how this works. And then if you look over in the Layers panel, now it has a new thing called Smart Filters, and it added that oil paint. Now I could add even more filters if I wanted to. So let's just do that for fun. I'll go down to Filter, and maybe I'll add a blur. So let me just add a Gaussian blur, and I'll click OK. Now, I obviously don't want my image to look blurry, but what I have here, I have some settings over on the right. So if I double click those settings, I can actually blend this. So maybe I can change this down to soft light, and then I reduce the opacity. And now I've removed that actual blur effect, but I've kind of given it a little bit more vibrant color with that filter. And I can even toggle that filter off and on inside of the Layers panel. Same thing with the oil paint. I could adjust those blend settings if I wanted to, or I could just go back and actually edit the effect itself. So if I double click over the name of that filter, it's going to reopen the oil paint filter, and you can see it's here over on the left. And now maybe I can kind of just make some changes to it. Now let's change the lighting because that'll be a little bit more obvious there. And I'll go ahead and click OK. But again, I still have full control over this raw edit. So I can double click that thumbnail, and that's going to open it up again inside of Camera Raw. So then maybe if I wanted to make it a little bit warmer, I could just increase the white balance there, click OK, and it updates everything completely non-destructively. Smart objects are pretty fun to work with. They give you a lot of opportunity. They do have some limitations. I'm not really going to be going into smart objects too much in this course, but I do think that they're really great, especially for these types of uses that I just showed you here, working with filters and plugins. And by the way, if you do work with plugins, they work very similarly to the filters in the fact that if you add a plugin to a smart object, make your edits, save it, and come back to the image, you can actually reopen that plugin once again, and it will retain all of those edits. That's another really beautiful thing about smart objects. But I want you to be aware of this type of layer because it can be a useful tool for certain types of applications. So it's not a bad thing to kind of keep in your back pocket. Maybe you'll want to kind of work with them down the road.